Welcome to Write Now Workshop Podcast, where you can write a book and change the world. I'm your host, Kitty Bucholtz, and this is episode 88, The Fascinating World of Mystical Realism, an interview with Shawn Smucker, coming to you on Thursday, July 12th, 2018. I have been reading Shawn's book for about a week, but I've been moving into hopefully our final wonderful home for about 2 weeks, so I'm only about a third of the way through it. The Edge of Over There is so interesting. It's just got my imagination tangled up in knots, and I think I'm dreaming about some of the different things that are happening in the story. It's been so fun for me to read and makes me crazy. I haven't finished it yet. So my interview with Shawn is full of a lot of excitement on my part. So I hope you enjoy that. I was almost a little embarrassed at a couple of points where I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. It really is. It's a really interesting book. And it just came out last week. Totally brand new, totally ready for you to read. I hope that you enjoy the interview. Shawn's got some great stories and some really great advice for writers. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. And have a great week. Happy writing. Today's guest is Shawn Smucker. In 2017, Shawn introduced readers to the enchanting world of 12-year-old Samuel Chambers in his debut novel, The Day the Angels Fell. His new book, The Edge of Over There, is the spectacular sequel to this highly acclaimed work. He lives with his wife and 6 children in the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and you can find him online at shawnsmucker.com, where you can also sign up for his newsletter in order to find out when and where the Tree of Life will turn up next. Welcome, Shawn.
Hi, thanks for having me, Kitty.
I'm so glad you're here. I have to say, I'm totally super psyched about talking to you about your book because right off the top of my head, you're the only person that I personally know in any way, and I've known you for, 10 minutes now, who writes anything like this one thing that I started once in grad school that I'm determined to finish as soon as I can figure out what the story is. So I'm super excited. So let's start with the first question. I've been telling people, get ready to listen to Shawn Smucker. He writes supernatural suspense. That because I didn't know what you called it, but what do you and your publisher call it?
The term that we settled on was mystical realism. But it's just kind of in that speculative fiction, umbrella. There's a lot of things that fit into that. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, I don't know that much about you and your writing, but 2017, so just last year as we're recording, was your debut novel, which was book 1 of the series. And now book 2, you're just telling me just released 2 days ago as we're talking, which was last week when the recording will go live. So super exciting. Tell us a little bit about your background as a writer.
Yeah, so I really started writing quite a bit when I was about 20 years old. I'm 40 now, 41. So in college is when I got the bug for writing. I had grown up reading constantly. So reading was kind of my first love. That's how I found my way into it. But then after college, I didn't do very much writing, at least professionally. I journaled every day, and I definitely wrote a lot of words. But I was mostly in the business world during that time. So then, in about 2006, I was approached by my aunt to see if I would co-write a book with her. She, her name is Ann Byler. She started Auntie Anne's Soft Pretzels, which is a large soft pretzel franchise mostly in the U.S., but also around the world.
Yeah, I'm like, wait a minute, don't I know those pretzels?
Yeah, so she was approached by a publisher to write her story, but she had never written a book before, so she wanted someone to come in and help her write it. And so I sent some sample chapters into the publisher. They loved it. And she hired me. So that was really my first intro into professional writing, writing for money. And then I started to write more along those lines. So I started to take on more and more co-writing projects, so that in about 2010, I started doing that full time. So that was, and that's what I've been doing for the last 8 or 9 years now is co-writing books, mostly memoirs. So then in 2014, one of the co-writing books that I wrote took me to Istanbul, Turkey, to write for a missionary who was dying of cancer. and his denomination wanted me to write his life story with him. So I arrived there, and it was just an amazing experience, but it had a huge impact on me because he was in his last couple of months. I would meet with him for 2 or 3 hours every other day. It was pretty obvious that he wasn't doing well at the time. And so in that process, I really had to face my own mortality, and working with him was kind of the seed for The Day the Angels Fell, which was the first book in the series. So I wrote that book in 2013 and then self-published it in 2014. And a few years later, I picked up a literary agent to help me get more co-writing work. And she read The Day the Angels Fell in its self-published form and thought that she could sell it. So she shopped it around, and we ended up signing a 3-book deal with Revell. And 2 of those books are books from the series. So The Day the Angels Fell, and then the sequel that just came out, The Edge of Over There.
Wow. That is a really interesting story. I'm so glad I asked about your background, because that was not what I expected you to say.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So now I'm thinking we need to bring you back and talk about, co-writing or ghostwriting and that sort of thing, in case people are interested in that topic. But let's stick on this one for a minute. So you've had, wow, I'm trying to count in my head. You had 6 or 8 years of professional writing experience before you even started your novel. And now you're well over the 10-year mark as far as professional full-time writer who makes your living this way.
Yeah, that's right.
That's brilliant. Okay, so 3-book deal, and this is book 2. So is it book 2 of a trilogy, or just book 2, there's always only going to be the original and a sequel?
So it is book 2 of a trilogy, but the 3rd book in the deal with Revell is an unrelated novel, a standalone, and not for young adults. It's just a normal general market fiction. So I don't have the 3rd book under contract anywhere yet. Okay.
Wow. And all right, so that's another thing that I wasn't 100% sure on when I was reading. So I've been moving, but reading every day your book, which has been, fantastic. I am pretty sure that it is responsible for some of the odd dreams that I've had, but
Oh, sure.
I find odd dreams to be like the ability to go to the movie theater and sleep at the same time. So I'm cool with that.
Nice.
So, okay, we don't want to talk too much about the books in as much as giving anything away, but I don't think that I really realize I'm probably a third of the way through book 2 and didn't fully realize when I started reading it that there was a book 1 that was the beginning of the story. But just for everybody who's listening, I actually haven't found it to be a problem the way that you've weaved in the backstory. I feel like that there was obviously something that was happening, but nothing that is keeping me from understanding what's happening now. But I didn't fully understand that it was a YA novel. And you said YA, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a hard one to categorize because I initially wrote it for my kids, thinking through this whole experience that I had in Turkey and really wrestling with the whole idea of death. So the first book really hones in pretty specifically on the question, could it be possible that death is a gift? And the second book is more of a continuation of that, and it approaches that question, but not quite so specifically. It's a little bit more concerned about, when does love turn into selfishness? When can our concern or our desire for our loved ones sort of turn into this thing that isn't healthy or isn't good? So that would be more of the second book's central question.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. So you've got a third book that's going to kind of wrap up this whole story, and then you've also got another different unrelated book under contract. So is that also kind of in this mystical realism, supernatural genre?
It is, yeah. So I tried to write it with a little bit less of that in mind. It basically starts off with a funeral director whose father has passed away, and it's the week of his father dying and him remembering sort of back into his childhood. But there's definitely an element of the mystical realism in his remembering. So like in his childhood memories.
Oh.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, this is way different from writing. Well, when I say obviously, depending on what kind of a life you live, it may not be as obvious. From an American standpoint, it seems obvious to me that this is totally different from writing or co-writing someone's memoirs. But since you came up with this idea, would we be right in saying Istanbul is part of the Middle East, or would that be called Central Asia? Or
That's a good question. Yeah, because Istanbul is, it has a bridge that it's in both Asia and Europe. I think it's probably still considered Asia, even though they would like to be considered more European, I think. But yeah. Good question.
It's funny. I just happened to be at a friend's house, so I'm in Sweden, and we were eating pizza, and in their dining room on the wall is this ginormous, really old map of, well, it's probably not the whole world because it doesn't have North and South America, but it's like Europe and Asia, and it's one of those old roll-up maps from school. Do you remember when we were really little? Yeah. But it's written in Swedish, and it's super old. So I was like, okay, that must be this, and this must be that. And it turns out that our friend, who's a teacher, was saying, this little tiny portion of the country is considered Europe, and across the water, the rest of the country is Asia. And he was talking just very briefly about how that can be, have a sense of tension, for the people there. So I'm just thinking about this, what appears to me to be an unusual switch, and I'm sure that you're going to continue with the others. So I don't mean permanent switch, but to go into this, and I keep thinking supernatural because that's the way that I look at, other similar books or the story that I have in my mind. But this mystical realism, supernatural, looking at the world differently with, the end of life and that sort of thing. It seems like that area of the world would be like a real different place for an American to be thinking about these things and asking themselves these questions. Is that part of what happened there?
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's such a mysterious place for someone, from the West to be, the 5 times a day call to prayer. The city itself the streets are just like spaghetti. I mean, there's no grids. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to how it's laid out. It's just evolved over time. And you have that interesting mix of it's now a Muslim country, but 1,000 years ago it was sort of the bastion of Christianity, and so you have this strange mix of architecture, and it definitely being there, it's easy to imagine these things that we call mystical, like just being every day, just happening and not really expecting it. So I'm sure that did have something to do with it.
And then the way that you set the books, though, was to make it with American children living in America, which it seems to me as a reader makes it even more of a dichotomy in what we would consider, the real world or our normal life, and this world that they're suddenly thrust into, which appears to be in our world. And yet, the whole idea of the tree of life being somewhere in our world or near our world, and then there being more than one. Whoa, mind-bending. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, I just really want to hear you talk about, the story, how you came up with some of these ideas. And it just sounds so interesting to me. And I'm still reading it, which is why I'm just like totally in the middle of your story.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think I'd always, I grew up in a Christian household, and I always was fascinated with the creation story, and especially at the end at the end of the fall, when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and the image that we're left with is these 2 angels guarding the entrance to the tree of life, and with this flaming sword. And I always thought in my mind that story shouldn't have ended there, like what happened after that? And so in book 1, that's really sort of the impetus for the whole book is that I sort of filled in my own myth to follow that. So in book one, it tells this legend of what actually happened was that the two angels who were left to guard the tree of life, one of them wanted to possess it, so that he could give the fruit to humans and they would be trapped on earth forever, and that he could then rule the earth. And the other one realized what was going on, and at the last minute was able to destroy the tree using the fiery sword. So because that happened and it's the tree of life, it still grows somewhere after it's destroyed. So it was, I don't know, it kind of just came up out of questions that I had, and that's a lot of the stories that I write come out of that, just wondering, either what happens after that, or where did this come from, or what if that would happen. And as I followed that line of thought, I kind of stumbled into what I thought was an interesting storyline. So
yeah, I totally get what you mean. I am a huge superhero fan. And particularly, I live with a Marvel man, so
okay.
I was taught to love Marvel comics more than DC. So, I got to have Wonder Woman on my side at least.
Yeah.
But it's funny because, after 10 or 20 or however many superhero movies that I've seen since Superman in 1978, you think about it, you're just washing dishes, staring out the window, riding a train, and you just think about superpowers, or somebody says, what superpower would you have if you could have one? And so the kind of backstory behind my superhero novels, even though they're set now in my mind, and I've never actually written it down, I keep thinking I should write it down for readers, is that superpowers came from when Cain killed his brother Abel, and God had to give him a punishment, and God needed to punish him in a way that would help Cain to understand why he was so angry and why human life was so valuable. So he gave Cain and all of his descendants supernatural powers to protect all of mankind and walk the earth forever.
Idea. That's a great idea.
I just love it. Like you said, you just have these thoughts, and all of a sudden you're like, that's cool. I gotta write that down, right? Yeah.
And I think too, for me, I've always wanted those things to be true. When I was a kid, we went to, I was in like first or second grade, and we went to this little place close in Lancaster, close to our school. It's called the Gnome Village. And so so they have like all this little stuff. You just hike through the woods, and then as you go, they've created all these little like nooks and houses and stuff like that. And I wanted that to be true so badly. And I think, I was super disappointed as I kind of, as it dawned on me, like this isn't true, or anyway, I don't think it is. But I think I just have always wanted that. I've always wanted there to be another side to the story. In these books, I talk about it being kind of the other side of the curtain, like I wanted there to be something on the other side. And so in my stories, I get to make that true.
Yeah. Oh, that is so cool. Now, do you think that you have other ideas brewing that are similar in nature? The whole like what if and what if it were true? Do you have like more kind of stuff like this?
The third book in the series will sort of continue along this path. I don't have, not really. I just finished the final novel in my first deal with Revell, and I'm about to send it into the editor. So that's the one that I was telling you about, The Funeral Director. I did sign a nonfiction deal with them for a book that comes out in October called Once We Were Strangers. And it's about a friendship that I developed with a Syrian refugee who lives in our city and his family. So it talks about, sort of the refugee stuff. And then I have 2 more novels that will come out with Revell after that. So I don't think I have anything else right now along those lines, but, I haven't really sat down and brainstormed for a while about story ideas. So
yeah, we'll a lot of deadlines.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, wow. This is so cool. So there's probably listeners who are thinking, I kind of have been wanting to do that, write some speculative fiction. And it works a little bit differently in the Christian world than in the not Christian mainstream, however we want to say it, world. It's interesting to me that there is some speculative fiction being sold in the Christian world because Like when I started writing romance, I actually was sending it to Tyndale and that sort of thing. But I didn't have the right tone and voice and like the right degree that they were looking for.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, in case other listeners are thinking, like, how could I sell speculative fiction to a Christian house? Or if they're not thinking that, but they have speculative fiction, like, what are some of the things that you've learned or different kinds of advice that you might offer other writers?
I would say not. It can be really easy up front to put a lot of pressure on yourself to try and write a very specific kind of book, like that's going to fit the Christian market, or that's not going to be Christian, or, it's going to fit a particular publishing house or all that. And I would just really encourage people not to worry about that stuff, to really focus on writing the best book that they can write. Because I think if I would have, in 2013, 14, 15, as I was working on this, on the day the angels fell, if I would have told anyone what it was about, they would have said, you're just not going to sell that in the Christian market, and,
Right.
and so, and, to be fair, that was a lot of the feedback that we got, was that this isn't Christian enough to be a Christian book. And the feedback we got from general market was, well, this is too religious, so,
Right.
so, but that said, I think you just have to write the best book you can, and hope that it crosses paths somehow with someone who has that same taste, So I was fortunate that my agent really liked it. And then of the 20 places that we shopped it, I was really fortunate that my editor at Revell, Kelsey Bowen, was handed the manuscript, read it, loved it. These things, you just can't really plan them out too much. So I think it's important to put everything that you can into the book that you're writing. And maybe a lot of people wouldn't give this advice, but I just think I don't think it does your writing any favors if you try and tailor it too much to any particular genre or house or market, Christian or not.
Yeah. And you're right. Some people have that view. Some people have the exact opposite view and teach that as well. So it makes me think that to a large degree, it probably depends on the writer. I think maybe the difference between the two views is the writer who just is trying too hard and has kind of gotten away from their heart for it. Because I think that you probably could write to market, as some people call it, if you are still writing within the story that you naturally would tell.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
But I totally see how, particularly in this field, speculative fiction, possibly speculative fiction in a more religious market, would be something that it seems to me, and in the, oh my gosh, how long has it been? Like 15 years that I've been familiar with what is and isn't selling in the CBA, the Christian Booksellers Association market, which I know at some point they changed the letters to be something else. But anyway, in the Christian market, speculative fiction was always a really hard sell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the phrase that you use there is perfect, in trying too hard. And I bump into so many writers who that's the impression that I get, is that they're just trying too hard to fit their writing into, what they perceive as the most sellable form. And to me, I feel like if it's hard enough to write a really good book,
yeah,
if you're just simply focused on writing a really good book, much less if you're trying to incorporate all these outside voices and everything. So
yeah. That is true. I mean, I certainly feel that way as a writer myself.
Yeah.
So I had a question that just came up while you were answering that. And here I go going, oh, what was my question? I just get so excited talking to other writers that sometimes I'm like, you're just being a little bit manic right now, Kitty. Your book has just got me thinking. I mean, it's really got me thinking about the possibilities and which is what I was just now going to ask you. So in the midst of trying not to be the person who's trying too hard and therefore sort of falling away from your own voice and story that was naturally going to be rising up, there's still, particularly, well, in every genre, but it seems to me more so in your genre, a certain amount of world building that needs to be created and adhered to and figure out the rules of the world. So how much of that were you working on kind of outside the story, like not in the middle of the writing? And how much of it do you think you just, I mean, I don't know, I haven't asked you yet if you're a plotter or a write by the seat of your pants kind of guy. So tell us a little about your process and specifically as it comes to world building. Did you stop and think about what all the rules of this world were going to be first? Did you just write it and discover it yourself, or?
Yeah, I usually write my way into things. So what was really interesting to me was with The Day the Angels Fell, the first book in the series, because I had self-published it and I had hired an editor to look through it before I self-published it. By the time my editor at Revell got a hold of it, it was pretty clean and had a lot of feedback. So she had some important things to say and to speak into it, but it was a pretty brief editorial process, and we didn't do a whole lot with it. With The Edge of Over There, the sequel, most of the edits that she was looking for had to do with world building. So, when I handed her the manuscript, I think it was about 80,000 words. And by the time we finished with it, it was about 95,000. And,
Wow.
and the majority of that went into the Edge of Over There section. So, trying to build that world up a little bit more so the reader had a better feel for it, that it was more consistent throughout. She had a lot of questions, what's this? Why is this happening? And so that was a huge part of the editorial process. As far as plotter or pantser, I used to not outline at all early in my writing days. And what I found was I would write myself into situations that just weren't going anywhere. I would find myself, a third or halfway into a story and either lose interest or just feel like, I don't even know what's going on, what the big picture is. And so what I've kind of started to do is now early on in the process, I still don't outline right away. I just my goal usually is to create an interesting character and really get to know them. And I feel like if I do that, a story will come up out of that. But now once I get to about the 15 to 20,000 word mark, I make a conscious decision to stop and start to think ahead a little bit more and say, okay, and it changes, the outline that I create at that point still might fluctuate quite a bit, but I didn't like that sense of, getting halfway through a book and then realizing, wow, this just isn't going anywhere. So I found it kind of a mixture has helped me. I
think I was talking to Susan May Warren a couple of weeks ago, and we decided that we are plotsers.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I like that way of doing it. And I've heard other people talk about that too. Like the first, 10, 20, everybody has a different number, 1,000 words are kind of just playing and figuring out what kind of a story has been building in the back of your head. And then you're like, oh, I think I've got it now. And then you kind of build some markers to write to so that it's a real story with beginning, middle, and end.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, fun. Wow. I'm really excited. This is very interesting to me as far as like the genre and stuff. So I think I might have to read book 1 and then find out more about book 3 when it comes out.
Yeah.
Now, the book that you just finished and are about ready to turn in, is that also YA or is that adult?
That's adult.
Okay. Excellent. Though I have to say, just for people who are listening, reading The Edge of Over There, I in no way was thinking angsty teenage emo kind of book. So.
Right. And it's really hard these days because I don't feel like The Day the Angels Fell or The Edge of Over There really fit into the current YA genre. There are some YA books that I've read and enjoyed, but I don't I don't know, even with my kids, like I've got a 15-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I don't really steer them into the YA section. I feel like I don't know, I don't really like the direction that contemporary YA is going necessarily. And so I wasn't really writing into that space, but I think it's difficult. It's a difficult book to classify, and just simply because of the protagonist's age, it's just unusual to have an adult book with a 13 or 14-year-old protagonist. So I think that was kind of the stumbling block as far as figuring out where to put it.
Yeah. Which is pretty much up to the marketing department anyway, right?
Right. Yeah.
They don't really ask for any input from you on that?
Not really. I mean, they want input, but I think the final decision is made by them. And I mean, I agreed with it. I did write it for my kids. I think the difference is that maybe a lot of YA writers or middle grade writers feel this way, but I don't write books, even though I wrote it for my kids. I wanted adults to enjoy it. I didn't try and dumb it down, or, I mean, not once did I think, oh, I shouldn't use that word, that's too advanced for a 13-year-old, or,
yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of, it's a strange one to categorize, but I guess it was the right one.
Sorry about that alarm going off.
Oh, that's okay.
And one question I was thinking about when you were talking about that you originally self-published the book, did you have in mind to write a trilogy when you self-published book one?
When I finished writing that book, I knew there would be a few others. And one of the reasons I did that partly was I really loved the characters, and the story I still felt like there was more to the story that I could tell. But I also, practically speaking, I thought I was going to be self-published, and had read a lot about the advantages of doing a series if you're self-publishing, just right. How it allows you to build up some momentum. And so that was some of the thinking behind that too.
Yeah. And then, so it sounds like it was a little bit of a surprise when your agent said, let me try to sell it anyway.
It was. I had finished The Edge of Over There. I'd finished writing it.
Oh.
This was probably the end of 2015. So Angels had been out for about a year, and I was getting ready to self-publish The Edge of Over There. And I thought, well, Ruth, my agent, was mostly just trying to help me find co-writing work. Like she didn't bring me on necessarily as a fiction writer. But I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I should probably let her know. So I sent her an email and said, hey, Ruth, I'm going to self-publish the sequel to this, this book that I wrote. And she was like, oh, why don't you send me a copy of the first one, and, I'll just take a look at it before you do anything with it. And so I sent it to her, and she really loved it and said, oh, you know what, why don't you give me a couple of months? And I was really hesitant at that point because I'd been down that road so many times as trying to get a publisher and trying to get, initially it took me a long time to get an agent. And one thing I loved about self-publishing was you write the book, you make all the decisions, you self-publish whenever you want, and then you move on, and I just didn't know if I wanted to wait another year and a half for the day the Angels fell to be published, and I'd already written the sequel. So it was going to be 3 years, 2.5 years before this book that I had just finished would ever get out there. So that was a hard kind of obstacle for me to get over. But I thought, you know what, I'll give her 3 months. And that initially she said, just give me 3 months. And so that was like probably January, February, March. And we had 2 houses that were kind of interested, but we weren't really sure what was going to happen. And they, it's just the process drags on. I mean, so they have their meetings once a month, and so we hear at the end of March, oh, we didn't get to talk about your book. So then it's going to be the end of April. And there were a couple times where I almost just pulled the trigger and said, Ruth, you know what, just withdraw the proposal. I just want to publish this book. It's already written. But we hung in there, and fortunately things worked out the way they did. So yeah, I mean, I was sitting on the edge of over there for almost 3 years, 2.5 years. Wow. It just came out last week. So
that's just amazing. Yeah. That is some patience that a lot of people don't feel that they really have.
Yeah. And it's a little bit hard because, so in the meantime, I wrote Once We Were Strangers, this nonfiction book that comes out in the fall. And I've now finished the first draft of the next novel that I have to hand in. And so now to go back and talk about Edge of Over There, it's like, oh my goodness, I really have to like rack my brain to think about, what is that book even about? It's crazy.
I was going to ask you if you had to go back and kind of reread / skim it just to get excited about launch week of this new story.
Yeah, I was really excited about it coming out, but I sat down just last night. I was talking with my brother-in-law, and he was asking me questions about the book, and I was thinking, man, I really need to look through that before I start doing these interviews and stuff, because I don't know how much I'll be able to answer.
Oh, I totally understand. One of the things that just is the way it is in traditional publishing.
Exactly. Yep.
Though I have to say, as a totally self-published author right now, also, completely open to being a hybrid author, but this is the direction I've gone. I keep writing things that are either too cross genre, too religious for some people and not religious enough or whatever, the right kind of religious for other people. Or my first book, I wrote chick lit just as chick lit crashed and burned. So, so I've kind of always been in the position of being willing, but just the wrong place and wrong time. But as even a self-published author, totally, there are still times when I'm like, how did that book end? The one that I wrote.
Yeah. And you know what? I would just encourage you to, if self-publishing is such a great option these days, but if you, or if anybody listening really wants to be a traditionally published author, and that was always a dream of mine, even as a self-published author, you just have to keep going, you just have to keep going and keep believing in yourself. And I think it's really important to understand that you can write really good books and not get a publisher. You can be a really strong writer and not have an agent. And so much of it is about, a chance meeting here, or, a relationship here that develops, or a recommendation here. So and the cool thing is with self-publishing, I think, is it gives you the opportunity to keep advancing as a writer. So you can finish a book, get it out there, and move on to the next book, and not feel like you're, just drowning with this one title that you can't get rid of or can't sell.
Right.
And so I think, just keep going, keep doing the work. And for me, that was such a huge thing, was that when my aunt came to me in 2007 and said, "Hey, will you write my book?" I had been writing religiously every day for probably 10 years at that point, either journaling or short stories. And so, if I would have waited until the opportunity came to me to write, I wouldn't have gotten it. I wouldn't have been where I needed to be as a writer. And I think that's the great thing. It's just you keep writing. And then when the opportunity comes, you're ready. Your writing is at the point where it needs to be.
That's brilliant advice. That's really great stuff. I hope listeners are kind of taking that to heart and understanding the power that there is in just keep going, basically.
Yeah.
And every time I say something like just keep going, in my head I hear Dory the fish, just keep swimming.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But it's true, because the strength of writing is really what sells it. So if you can constantly be getting better and better and better books out, eventually you'll be interviewed by somebody who's like, so you're just like this coming out of the blue, big explosion of a writer. You're like this brand new. And you're like, yeah, the 17 books before this one just haven't been as popular.
Exactly. Yeah, I know. I wrote a blog post soon after I got my first book deal with Revell about how, this has been 17 years in the making. I had been writing since I was 20 years old every day. And, it wasn't until I was 37, 38 that I got that first book deal. So it's a long road. It can be.
But it sounds like you're happy and that it was a good road.
It has been. Yeah.
That's awesome. Shawn, this is great. I'm so glad that you had such encouraging things to say to people. And of course, I loved talking about, the whole, how this, I hesitate to use the word weird because some people think that's a negative connotation. Totally cool, interesting, weird book came about.
Yeah.
Oh man. So if listeners are excited about my excitement and want to know where they can find out more about you and your books, where should they go?
Sure. So you can go to ShawnSmucker.com. I have a My Books tab that you can check out. Um, I don't know how much longer this will be going on, but I know that in the U.S. you can order The Day the Angels Fell, the first book in the series, from Baker Bookhouse for $5 right now, the hardback. And I think that's just for a limited time. Otherwise, you can get, both of the books wherever you normally buy books.
Excellent. Very good. Note to self, as soon as I finish this.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. This has been great fun. And just to let people know who are listening and not watching on YouTube, you are SHAWN, right?
Yes. Yep, that's right.
SMUCKER.
Yes.
.com. Awesome. Shawn, thank you so much. This has been great fun.
Yeah, it was really nice chatting, Kitty. Thank you.